1915. Some of the most desperate struggles in the First World War unfolded amid the peaks of this spectacular alpine landscape. Beneath the summits occupied by Austrian and Italian troops, a maze of tunnels and caverns was carved out to gain just a few meters of tactical advantage. Mountain soldiers climbed, fought, and died over and under the highest peaks of the Dolomite range. The most famous of them all was Tyrolean mountain guide Sepp Innerkofler. The mystery surrounding his assault on Monte Paterno still haunts this alpine peak. After Italy signed the secret Treaty of London in 1915 and entered the First World War, the Dolomites became one of the fronts between Italy and Austria. Italian and Austrian mountain troops raced to capture strategic mountain passes. Here, harsh high mountain warfare involved firefights in the trenches and close combat in the labyrinth of tunnels that had been hewn into the rock.
Controlling the peaks and ridges would have allowed anyone to dominate the valleys below. A good battery of artillery, well positioned, could therefore be absolutely decisive on this part of the front.
The names of the natural fortresses would go down in history, associated with the harsh reality of alpine warfare. Marmolada, Col di Lana, Monte Piana, Monte Paterno, and the Tre Cime. Andy Hawkins and Julia Richardson are archaeologists of the British Durand Group and experts in tunnel warfare. They have come to explore the incredible mountain battlefields that stretch along the Sexton Dolomites, including the trenches and dugouts at the foot of Monte Piana and the tunnel works excavated in Monte Paterno. Andy and Julia enlist the help of a local guide, Paolo Tassi, who will help them trek across the front line of the White War in the Dolomites.
So the Italians were there in a strong position. The Austrians were the ones that needed to get up into that position and take that position.
Take that position was an unbelievable position to control this area.
Situated in northeast Italy above Cortina, Mount Paterno overlooked one of the most beautiful and recognizable mountains in the Alps, the Tre Cime di Lavaredo, three massive freestanding limestone towers in the Sexton Dolomites.
Anyone who studies the Great War comes across extraordinary figures, and one of the most extraordinary figures was Sepp Innerkofler.
Until 1919, these three peaks, known as the Drei Zinnen in German or the Tre Cime di Lavaredo in Italian, were the border between Italy and Austria. On the 24th of May 1915, Italy joined Britain, France and Russia in the most devastating war the world had ever seen. The young nation had fought the Austro-Hungarian Empire repeatedly to regain parts of its territory inhabited by Italian speakers. Trent and Trieste remained in Austrian hands. And now Italy saw its opportunity to gain the cities and overthrow the Germanic empires.
The
Italian army saw the whole Dolomite front that went from Marmolada to the Dolomites of Sextant as a way of breaking into the Puster Valley. And that's why the Italian army pushed very hard in that direction.
On that front, on one day it was the Austrians, and then another day it was the Italians. At that time it was the Italians occupying the summit of Monte Paterno, and it was strategically important for both the Austrians and the Italians.
The Tre Cime, or as it was called in war, the Zinnen Plateau, was very important defensively
because that is where the border passed.
One man, Tyrolean mountaineer Sepp Innerkofler, would become a hero in this high mountain battle.
Sepp Innerkofler, for us mountain guides in the 21st century, remains a model like all the guides of that era. Still today, we guides accompany tourists up those peaks, following in their very footsteps.
Innerkofler took up arms to fight what he saw as enemy encroachment on his beloved mountain homeland. But he ended up having to fight his Italian neighbors, the very men who once had waved at him from nearby peaks or shared a drink in the mountain hut he had built in the years before war broke out.
A mountain chain, more than dividing, often brings together populations. To survive in an alpine environment, to farm and live, is tough. Mount Paterno you can find approximately here, in a southwesterly direction behind the Langlandspitze, and a little further, Toblin's Tower. From the Paterno, they could see the valley, and they could control the whole plateau. That's why Paterno was so important.
Christian Innerkofler is the great-grandson of Sepp Innerkofler. Today, he carries on the family's mountain tradition, running the Dolomitenhof, which his legendary great-grandfather founded more than 100 years ago. The Innerkofler family had farmed for generations before Sepp was born in 1865. He learned to climb and shoot from the best, masters in his own family. He would put up at least 50 first ascents in the area, including the first top climb of the central Big Peak pillar. He climbed on the Matterhorn too, but his beloved peak was the Patternkofel, Mount Paterno. During the First World War, what was once a leisure climb became a life-and-death military operation. Before the outbreak of the First World War, along the Dolomites that were the border between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Italy, Tyrolean mountaineer Sepp Innerkofler had gone from humble farmhand to making his fortune as one of the alpine guides most in demand for taking rich mountaineers up the peaks south of the Puster Valley.
Zuerst war als Knecht bei einem Bauern tätig und dann war als
First, he was a farmhand. Then he worked at a sawmill where he worked nights, so he could go mountaineering during the day. And very soon, it was clear that as a mountain guide, he had a lot of skill. And then over time, he got his guiding license.
sehr große Fähigkeiten hatte und hat dann im Laufe der Zeit eben die Bergsteigerprüfung erworben.
Sepp Innerkofler.
Sepp Innerkofler, a great climber and an even greater guide who had the privilege of opening a number of routes in the Dolomites.
By the end of the 19th century, the golden age of mountaineering for scientific pursuit was turning into an era of competitive sport for the middle class.
Right behind us here is the Locatelli.
Oh, this is it's a nice story in the Rifugio Locatelli because was the original name was Traizinenhütte.
Okay.
Rifugio Tracime in Italian. And then it was destroyed by the Italians and renominated in honor of a famous climber called Sepp Innerkofler.
War eine Art Pionier für das Tal, für den Ort Sexten, für den Fremdenverkehr.
He was a pioneer for foreign tourism because he was the first to recognize that the whole valley around Sexten could be a tourist attraction for foreigners.
Ausgangspunkt eben zum Bergsteigen.
After 5 years of guiding, Innerkofler married Maria Stadler, a young Austrian woman, herself an accomplished climber and the first woman to reach the summit of the small peak of Lavaredo. They had 5 children and soon had a booming mountain refuge business.
Mit seinen ersten Einkünften hat dann eben die erste.
With his early clients, he built the first Dreizinenhütte mountain refuge, but it was too small. And then he built the Dolomitenhof in Fischleintal in 1905 and another small bed and breakfast.
Ein Garni, also eine Frühstückspension im Ort draußen.
While most alpine mountaineering had been on glaciers, the eastern Alps had many vertical rock faces.
viele Erstbesteigungen gemacht.
He made a number of first ascents. One of the best known was the north face of the small peak of Lavaredo. At the time, there were English, Austrians, Dutch people who were coming to the area, and they all had money, and they all wanted him with them as their guide.
Leute mit Geld oder Adelige, die wollten dann alle mit ihm in die Berge gehen.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
He would become a pioneer of vertical rock climbing.
Sepp is remembered for his many first ascents, especially for the first climb of the small peak of Lavaredo, the most common and most difficult route, and for the climb of northwest peak of Mount Paterno.
Many things have changed since Innerkofler made his famous climb.
Back then, ropes were thicker and absorbed a lot of water and were not all elastic. They were rigid. And now we have climbing shoes with a smooth sole and good grip. Once upon a time, they used big climbing shoes that had very little sensitivity with thick soles that were rigid and made of felt. Climbing was unprotected and much more difficult. Very rarely could one fix a screw and pass the rope through a carabiner. Often you use the rock and the natural face, or you could use the shoulder harness, which I'll show you. Try to imagine from this position trying to keep your partner from falling. Today, modern climbing puts safety over adventure. The mental strength of Sepp Innerkofler and the climbers of that era was really formidable.
In 1915, the road that ran along the valley became strategic as it opened the way to Vienna and Innsbruck. If the Italians had broken through this narrow chain of peaks, they would have controlled the supply routes to Trent.
Through the Puster Valley, it was easy to invade the pulsing heart of Austria. Innsbruck was just around the corner.
On the other hand, the Austro-Hungarian High Command were more concerned about the eastern front. The main thrust of the Italian armies was towards Gorizia, where their advances threatened to break the Austrian Empire in half. Sepp Innerkofler was a member of the 3rd Company of the Standschützen, the Austrian Alpine militia, based in Sexton.
As Italy declared war on the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all the able-bodied men in town were sent to the other fronts. In the village, there were just older people, the youth or those who were unfit for war, and Sepp was one of those. That's why he was still in town.
The Standschützen were local mountain guides, porters, herders and foresters who all had the crucial survival skills for operating in high, rugged terrain. They formed flying patrols that were little more than rifle clubs subsidized by the government. But when Italy began making incursions into Austrian territories, the Emperor mobilized 38,000 of these tough local soldiers.
They defended their valleys. They knew how to move in that terrain. They had a real winning aspect. They were excellent marksmen. And of course, not without reason. The people in that area lived off hunting. So, of course, for their own survival, they had to be good marksmen.
Kaiserjäger, Alpine troops from the regular Austro-Hungarian army, as well as a regiment of the German Army Alpenkorps, were also deployed in the area. The 56-year-old guide was a section sergeant of a flying patrol of the top 12 climbers in town.
With the few people who were left in town, mountaineers, the elderly and the young, They organized these flying patrols to be lookouts across all of the peaks of the Sexton Dolomites, so that it gave the impression that all the mountain summits were always occupied. Every day, they climbed up to the top of 2 or 3 different peaks and showed themselves in order to deceive the Italians.
Die Italiener zu täuschen.
On the first day of war, Sepp Innerkofler climbed to the top of the Monte Paterno and observed Austrian artillery rain down shells on Italian troops in the village of Misurina.
The first shells were shot from the highly defended Monte Rudo, even before the ultimatum that Italy had given Austria, and they hit the saddle of Col di Mezzo and the Alpini, who were working on reinforcing the trench works. From there, Captain Mazzini, from the 58th Mountain Battery, responded, moving up to the saddle of Lavaredo on the first day of the war, and shelling and burning the Dreizinnenhütte.
The Italian troops who rushed up the mountain valleys as the Austrians retreated to the peaks were the legendary Alpini. The Alpini moved fast over passes and along crests to occupy the high ground. On the other side, the Austrians were assisted by several battalions of the German Alpenkorps, but they were largely outgunned and outmanned. Sepp Innerkofler knew it was vital now to occupy the peak of the mountain.
Und schon damals hatte gesagt zum Befehlshaber, zum österreichischen Befehlshaber.
Even at that point, he had told his Austrian commanders that Mount Paterno should have been occupied because it was strategically very important. But they did not listen to him. They took it in, but then told him to come back down. And 2 days later, the Italians were on the peak. And then the Austrian commanders realized how important it was, and they gave Innerkofler and his flying patrol the task to take it back. He said, "This is practically impossible, but we will try."
Das ist fast unmöglich, aber wir werden es versuchen.
Andy and Julia trek toward the saddle below Paterno. From here, it is clear why these peaks were of such strategic importance. Ahead of them is the Sextenstein Mountain and Toblin Tower. To their right, Monte Paterno. They opt to try the route round the top of the mountain to the Italian-held positions, tunnels that were dug during the 2-year battle that raged around these peaks. Their starting point is the entrance to the Italian gallery. For safety, Andy and Julia harness up for the most dangerous part of their day, a traverse along a narrow path below the peak of Paterno that leads to the next wartime tunnel opening. The snow is high and the drop to the bottom sheer. On the 18th of June, Innerkofler earned a silver medal for maintaining his observation position on Cima Uno after a violent hand-to-hand fight with Italian Alpini. The Italians were advancing and taking control of the surrounding peaks that overlooked the passes and the road to Sexton and the Brenner Pass. It was during this initial standoff that men from both the Italian and Austrian armies silently observed an incredible scene.
There was a reconnaissance troop from the flying patrol that went behind Italian lines. And while there, he killed a chamois buck to bring back home, but it attracted attention. One of their exploration routes was discovered. The Italian troops cut off their return route, so he had to go a different way, and he ended up opening the first route behind a glacier.
He brought the animal down in a dramatic scene of death, tipping off the enemy. Intent on taking back Monte Paterno, the Austrian High Command ordered Innerkofler to lead his 5 best men of the flying patrol in an attack against the stronghold. It was a suicide mission, and he knew it.
Ja, weil die Italiener sind ja über die Südseite vom Paternensattel aufgestiegen.
The Italians had gone up from the south side of the Paterno. That was much easier. And he had to go over the northwest face, which was a lot more difficult. A plan was put into place, how he was supposed to take it. In the early morning hours, they set out. He told his son, who was 17 years old at the time and was also part of the flying patrol, "Today, you are not coming with us. Today, you stay home, because we may not come back." And that's how it was told to me by my grandfather, who had watched it unfold from below.
The attempted climb and battle of Monte Paterno on the 4th of July 1915 would go down as one of the greatest legends and mysteries of Alpine warfare. July 1915. As the sun rose over the village of Sexton, Sepp Ingerkofler was already at the base of the north wall of the Monte Paterno. All was calm and silent as his sons watched his ascent with a small patrol of soldiers. To see the exact route Ingerkofler climbed, Paolo, Giulia and Andy climbed toward Paterno from the location of the guide's traditional refuge, the Dreizinnenhütte. It is a spectacular view. Below Ingerkofler, a platoon of 30 Austrian Landesschützen and a few military engineers, including Sepp's brother, were prepared to help hold the Monte Paterno once secured. Machine gun and artillery cover was in place. The battle would be witnessed by thousands. The 6 soldiers were all renowned guides in the Sexton Valley. Armed with carbines and hand grenades, they left their barracks near the burned-out Dreizinnenhütte.
To capture a well-occupied peak, it was often necessary to orchestrate a surprise attack and take advantage of everything that nature and the weather offered.
La parete nord, lo spigolo nord.
The north face, the north chimney, like all the north faces in the Alps, gave the rock face a gloomy aspect. The climb up the north chimney of the Paterno has not changed. But you have to imagine that the first mountaineers who went up these faces found very brittle rock. With time, the rock has become harder. The difficulty of the climb remains the same, but the excitement of discovering new routes is long gone.
Ne è rimasta la difficoltà dell'arrampicata. Quella alpinistica e la grande scoperta ne è venuta meno. Arrivati in prossimità della vetta.
Arriving close to the peak, Sepp Ingerkofler untied his rope and alone set out to attack the summit.
Tentò l'assalto alla parete, alla cima.
I believe what my grandfather told me. He told me that the plan was that, under the cover of darkness, they were supposed to climb, and as they neared the peak, he would give the Austrian troops a sign to give cover fire, and then he was supposed to throw grenades over the top and then storm the peak.
The veteran guide climbed, with no technical aids, toward the surprise assault, with artillery cover lending support. According to eyewitness reports, artillery fragments hit Sepp and another climber, but they kept going. What happened when he reached the top is still the subject of heated controversy today. At the summit, Ingerkofler threw 3 hand grenades into the Italian trenches, but they didn't explode. Then, in a hail of rocks and artillery and machine gun fire, Sepp Ingerkofler was killed. whether it was by friendly fire, an Italian bullet, or by a rock thrown by one of the legendary Alpini, is still today a matter of debate.
Le versioni contrastanti riportano diverse
There are different versions about the last moments of Innerkofler's life.
atti della vita di Innerkofler. La parte sicuramente più
The
tragica
part that is certainly most tragic of his grand act of heroism is that he lost his life in front of his son.
e che perì davanti agli occhi di suo figlio.
Angelo Loschi, the stretcher bearer, braved Austrian enemy fire and tried to descend down the Opel chimney to recover the body of his dead friend. After 3 fatiguing days, the body of Sepp Innerkofler was recovered, and the Alpini dug a niche on the top of Monte Paterno, and with the guide's rope they made a cross, and covered his personal objects with flowers, and Sepp remained up there, in the arms of the peak of his beloved mountain, for 3 years.
Today, his memory is still alive along the vie ferrate that mountaineers continue to climb, following the paths he heroically forged. With Monte Paterno firmly in Italian hands, the next mountains down would become key for access to the strategic Fischlein and Puster valleys. From the site of Sepp Innerkofler's historical refuge, Andy and Julia have a clear view of the 2 positions Italy and Austria would fight for 2 years to control.
Here we are just at the bottom of these two mountains. The mountain on the right
Yeah,
is called Torre di Toblin, Toblinerkopf.
Toblinokov,
Yes.
just here.
Just
The
on the
twin
right.
peaks.
The twin peaks, exactly. And this one on the left is called Sasso di Sesto, Sechsterstein.
Sechsterstein.
Yes.
Okay.
Can you imagine during the war, the Italian, they were here, and the Austro-Hungarian, they were.
Okay.
Paolo, Giulia and Andy have reached the tunnels at the base of Monte Paterno and head inside to explore their depths. Since the Italian Alpine troops were unable to attack the Puster Valley without much more support than they had, they simply occupied the peak of the Monte Paterno.
Monte Paterno represented the linchpin of the defensive line of the Lavaredo saddle, and this was a very important defensive line that arrived all the way to Forcella Piandicengia and Colle Arena, so as to block the Austrians at the head of their own valleys.
In the weeks that followed, the Tre Cime would become an Italian citadel of cannons, spotlights and machine gun nests. The Austrians dug into defensive positions, with cannon and mortars, and trenches connected by deep tunnels and fields of barbed wire at Schwabenaltenkopf and Raukofel. The Austrians' forward lookout post was on top of the Toblin Tower. The most advanced Italian outpost was on top of Monte Paterno. The area in between was exposed to deadly crossfire. Cheap, portable and easily hidden, the machine gun was the most effective weapon in these conditions, and in the hands of a well-trained gunner could control large swathes of mountainside, even an entire pass. The Alpini dug cave shelters that were connected by deep tunnels. The longest one linked the Monte Paterno position with the front line, crucial for the Italians because it allowed them to control the movements of the Austrian infantry on the plateau below, inflicting heavy losses.
It's been built up to a point where I think undersized that you could maybe mount a tripod machine gun on it.
Right, okay.
So they've raised it and it looks back across the valley floor.
Okay.
Okay, so
covering that ground, yeah.
Could well be.
But of course, up here, the machine guns were the dominant choice, really, weren't they? Because they're light, portable.
Yeah.
You can move into any position. They cover a large area.
Yeah. Your machine guns, your mortars, right, and your light artillery is what you'd use actually in a battle. right, your really heavy artillery, you're trying to pound the enemy with those, right, and dislodge him from his entrenched positions so that you can advance upon them. So this is very much a defensive gallery, but also one that provides shelter for the troops as well.
In March 1917, the 3rd Company of Standschützen of Innsbruck, who were dug in at the saddle between the Tre Cime and Toblin Tower, decided to try to take the Italian position. There was a massive snowpack of over 3 meters, into which they dug a long tunnel toward the Italian position. A month later, they reached the base of the rocky outcrop, and 50 Austrians entered the Italian tunnels in a surprise attack. The Austrians took the position after an hour of fighting. The Italian counterattack forced the Austrian troops to the peak of the mountain, and eventually they retreated back to their original positions. The biggest challenge for both armies was the logistics of transport and supply in the rugged mountain terrain. Troops and mules carried supplies on their backs, with loads of up to 25 and 100 kilos respectively. A labyrinth of tunnels and cable cars were built to supply both sides as they prepared for battle.
Un altro dato molto significativo sulla guerra di montagna, sulla guerra bianca, sulla guerra a contatto con madre natura.
Another significant number regarding the White War, the war that involved close contact with Mother Nature, especially during the winter, was represented by the number of dead after 2 winters of war on the Italian-Austrian front. 10,000 of the fallen were victims of the White War on both sides.
Erano stati vittime della guerra bianca su entrambi i fronti.
The winter of 1915 was one of the coldest of the whole 20th century, and on the high mountain peaks, neither side could move. The Alpini once again stormed the Toblin Tower. The tunnels carved in Monte Paterno allowed the Alpini to supply their outpost. Still today, remnants of their battle for survival underground remain. Giacomo Bollini has collected many objects from the era.
Per proteggere le mani dal freddo molto spesso venivano dati in dotazione guanti come questo che proviene direttamente da...
To protect their hands from the cold, often they were given gloves like this that comes directly from a glacier. You even see today the rabbit fur on the inside. Another problem was reflection of the sun off the snow.
Del sole sulla neve. Contro riverbero.
Anti-reflective glasses like these were given to both the Austrians and the Italians, and for the snowstorms they were given these goggles, which also had rabbit fur around them.
Invece di occhiali come questi, fodorati anch'essi di pelo.
Just to physically, work in there. I mean,
It's a precarious place to be working away, isn't it?
It was an unbelievable, dangerous work because you have to put exactly the stones in the right place and you're next to the cliff.
As the sun sets over the mountains that the Austrians and Italians fought furiously around, Andy and Julia descend the narrow mountain path to their starting point under the 3 peaks of Lavaredo. To understand the battle for the Dolomites better, they have decided to visit a new sector of this front the next day, the western slopes of the Monte Piana and the defences of Val Fonda. Here, in the valley between the Cristallino mountain and the Strudelkopf, stood the frontier between Italy and Austria. To the right, Monte Piana, a flat mountain, ideal for infantry attacks and vital for road access into the Pusta Valley. Unlike Sexton, which was protected by nature as much as by men, here, if the Italians had captured Monte Piana, they would also have been able to push up into the strategic lifeline of Trent. These trenches, however, were as far as the Italian infantry could go. Thousands of lives were lost on the mountain overlooking it, but here the line held. Fierce battles raged here as the Italian army tried to outflank the chain of mountains from Monte Piana to Monte Paterno. This battle became a life-and-death struggle for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The area is still strewn with artifacts from the First World War.
Barbed wire. Now that's interesting because you know all the barbed wire we've been seeing has been double strand.
Yeah, well this is triple.
Andy and Julia come across the site of an old bunker, perhaps a cook shack, based on the food tins and water cans left behind.
Tell you what it is. It's a chimney.
Oh, of course.
So that's
with the top with the cap to it.
Yeah.
And the smoke coming out here.
Soldiers hunkered down in these trenches and bunkers for months on end.
It's a good position, perfect position really,
Yeah.
to have your machine gun.
Yeah, and it wouldn't surprise me if this area didn't receive quite a bit of bombardment. Well, that was very interesting.
But life in the trenches could turn deadly fast.
Looking at this is actually a high explosive shell. Yeah. But you can imagine that hurtling through the air at sort of several thousand metres per second.
Very hot when it hits something
Yes,
or somebody.
yeah, somebody, you know, that's a killer.
Definitely, they're everywhere. Yeah. Oh, that looks a bit different. What's this? It's a different shape. Oh, it's a fuse, isn't it?
Oh, let's have a look. Well, this is probably for what we would call a shrapnel shell, proper shell.
Okay.
Okay. And the shrapnel shells were filled with lead balls.
Like the size of marbles, weren't they? That kind of size.
Yeah,
and lots of them packed in.
Yeah. And if you remember on the Somme, there's lots of them.
You do find
but
them.
the way it works is that if you just look, you can see these sort of marks.
And the numbers.
Right, so that's seconds.
Okay, so
okay.
18, 20, 22, 24, 28.
Yeah, so they're seconds. So what the gunner does is they calculate the time of flight from where they are to the enemy position, okay, and they want it to go off in the air.
Andy and Julia come across a monument, apparently hand-built by the survivors of an Italian infantry company that occupied this position.
So you've got full in Giuseppe there, and then full in Giuseppe. So it's obviously, this is being built by the soldiers themselves.
For 3 years, Zepp Innerkofler's body lay on the top of his beloved Monte Paterno. The Tyrolean mountain guide had died fighting for the Austro-Hungarian Empire in a key battle against the Italians for strategic Dolomite gains during the First World War. In August 1918, a small expedition led by Innerkofler's son exhumed his remains and brought them home to his family in Sexton, where he was buried here in the village churchyard.
Both sides knew each other. They knew each other before the war, and they knew of each other's great skill, and there was a sense that it was absurd that he had to die at war.
Innerkofler's body still lies today in the family grave in Sexton. The mystery surrounding his death, however, has never been fully dispelled.
The opinions about Innerkofler's death are varied, and the historians are divided about the 3 different versions that are told.
I climbed up the Sextonstein with experts, and it is in perfect range of a machine gun toward the Opal chimney, so it fits. So it is possible that it was a burst of machine gun fire from the Austrians. I believe, at least in my own personal interpretation, that at dawn, the Austrian soldiers mistook the soldiers of Innerkofler's patrol as they were climbing up for Italians who were going down.
The story would not be complete without the version told by the Italian Alpine troops who conquered and kept the Monte Paterno. Here in the unique memorial park dedicated to the Alpini dead of Italy's wars, Andy and Giulia meet the nephew of the giant Alpino Pietro De Luca.
De Luca was an Alpino of the 6th Regiment who was defending Monte Paterno.
The versions are all consistent until the point Inakofler reaches the summit. In the Italian version, it is a giant Alpino who kills him.
Inakofler scaled the vertical face and arrived on the top, and the moment he arrived at the summit, De Luca realized it, and Inakofler threw the grenades, and De Luca, who was wounded and had nothing in his hands, he didn't have his rifle, picked up a rock and threw it down at the guide, and it hit him, and Inakofler fell.
The version of the Alpino De Luca, who launched a rock to kill the great Alpine guide, was certainly a convenient version for the Italian military. My grandfather always told me that he was hit by cover fire, by friendly fire. That is how my grandfather always told it, based on what he saw.
Perhaps the version of Inakofler dying at the hands of Italian De Luca was the most acceptable to both sides, because admitting to have killed such an important and famous man as Inakofler in the first days of the war could have been something the Italian military could boast about and use for war propaganda.
This is De Luca, wounded. It is enough to look at his figure to see just how big he was, and in fact, many said that he had hands as big as spades.
De Luca would eventually emigrate to South America, and the generations after him would hand down stories about him to their Italian relatives.
My grandfather was really handsome and very tall, with a head that shone, and his eyes blue as the sky over his beloved city of Treviso. These are the words she writes, no? His hands were enormous and strong, hardened from work, but soft for a caress.
The Inakofler family would have no choice but to continue their mountain business, despite the hardship of war.
He was certainly a very courageous man. He was a known figure who essentially died for his fatherland. His wife, Maria, had to look after all the Dolomiterhof, and naturally after his death, she would have to take it all forward. Nothing was certain. Nothing was easy.
We can't forget these things. If you explain it in the schools, they don't believe it. These are things they don't understand because now it is the modern era. You push a button and do everything. But back then it was strength, hands, legs, and your head above all.
The Italians were eventually forced to retreat from the vast, high-altitude front after the disastrous Battle of Caporetto in the east, where 250,000 men were lost. The Dolomite territory, including Trecime, Tyrol and Bolzano and Trent, would return to Italian hands by the Treaty of Versailles. 1 million Austrian and Italian men died in the First World War, many of them, like Sepp Inakofler, along this treacherous mountain front. Today, throughout the area, the trenches, iron ladders and narrow tunnels are an eerie reminder of the tragic battles that unfolded in the First World War, and the many ordinary and extraordinary men who sacrificed their lives above and below some of the most impressive mountains of the Alps.